I'm so excited to bring to you the Academy I3 podcast. This is a series of podcasts where we lead with open hearts and open minds to inspire, inquire, and impact the workforce. For this episode, we'll be focusing on the topic of simulation. And today we have our guest, Derrin Ford. Derrin, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, thanks for having me, Charlie. Yes, my name is Derrin Ford. I have been a practice coach and trainer for the past 2 years working with the Academy. My role is to facilitate simulations, act as a actor sometimes in facilitations and simulations, and to support the social workers with their engagement practices. How I feel my impact is with that, I think we are having change conversations, which I think is very impactful in this role, having or helping people recognize how to get better at their job from a third party perspective. I think is very interesting of a role that we play. And so how those conversations impact how they see themselves improving, I think is one of the impacts I feel like we have in this role, and I really enjoy it. So looking forward to continuing that and seeing how people can get better at their job is overall what we're trying to do to support.
Awesome. That's really awesome. And for today, with Sim, it's a great experience, and especially for myself coming into this role. I mean, I've been a coach in this role for about a year, and it's been awesome to kind of experience what Sim is like. I think it's a very unique experience. And for those of you who may not know what that is, Sim is a simulation of what a real life experience might be for a worker to engage with the family. So we set up that simulation currently. It's in a virtual environment. So being able to have a worker go through the experience of what it's like to knock on the door of a family and engage with them that way, or to sit down and have a formal interview with them and asking them questions, and really how to navigate the conversation. So that way it's not just checklist items, but it's more so how they can really connect with the family member while also gaining information to support them overall with their case. So with Sim today, I think we're going to, touch on a couple of different key points that we want to highlight to really think about what it will be like for workers to go into that simulation experience and really how to maximize it. So with our first question, I really want to dive in, with Derrin, I wanted to ask, why do you feel Sim is important?
You know what, Charlie, to add to what you already said about simulations, I think it has a reflection, look in the mirror sort of vibe to it. And what I mean by that is I think it's supportive and helpful for people to see how they would engage in an actual simulation, or I'm sorry, in an actual environment in which engaging with the family. And so checking biases, managing frustrations, realizing what sort of people get under your skin versus other people that are easy to work with. I see it as that as well, and to help and have conversations around that frame of mind that from my experience people don't tend to do as often as they may have assumed. It's like, oh, I check my biases at the door. I didn't realize, like, men or women who talk at a certain volume get under my skin. Whatever some of the things have been said, I think has been something I've also noticed in simulation that is a good look in the mirror to say, hey, once you're actually out in the field, check these things, as what will you're experiencing now will be similar to what you actually experience in real life.
Right, because with the sim experience, you're being able to experience that in sort of more of a safe environment, an environment that is supportive by the coaches who are there to facilitate, by the actors, facilitators as well. And so it becomes a place of practice, especially one where it's like you said, once you go into the environment in the real world, things are a little bit more, like it's going to happen, and you kind of have to just be ready for that. Whereas in this environment, being able to try on things, being able to kind of see, did I say this, and how did that person react? And then being able to kind of see, can I build on that and really sort of sharpen that skill?
Absolutely. It's kind of like a intense mock interview where it's like, hey, if asked these questions, how you will respond, well, it's going to impact, what that looks like for whatever you're interviewing for. And this is just another version of that. I think the acting, we're not professional actors, but I do think we are pretty good at adjusting to what people are finding themselves comfortable in, and then challenging that, and to see how people react in that heat of the moment is pretty interesting to see.
Yeah, we're definitely not professional actors, but I feel like it does give us a good opportunity to, as you know, I've had that experience to practice as an actor as well, and it's a really neat experience because you have to really find that fine line between, okay, should I be going this far? And, if I do so, being able to see how that's going to be supportive for that worker that I'm practicing with. Because, of course, we're not trying to traumatize anyone, but we're really trying to show this is what real life experiences can be. And how can we sort of practice that now to where you can at least have that exposure to where it's not going to be a surprise and it's not going to be something later on when you experience it, you can at least have some skill sets to kind of navigate through that.
Absolutely. And even going back to your point of it being, why is it so important? It's hopefully worst case scenario if you go into the field when simulation is intense. However, sometimes it's not. Speaking to those who have went through simulations that are now supervisors and play different roles within CFS. Now you hear a lot of the times like, wow, I'm glad I had simulation because it was very similar to what I experienced in real life, or if it was a little bit more intense than what I experienced in simulation. So having that reference point, I think, is a really good takeaway with simulation, is that though it may feel awkward, though it may feel like, oh, I would never experience this in the field, if the takeaway is at least a reference point of what to expect, then I think everybody's doing their job.
And kind of now diving deeper a little bit into simulation, I think really key part of it is engagement. Is how do we provide that experience to where they can truly engage, beyond just, like I mentioned before, beyond just asking questions, but really getting into the experience of I'm connecting with another person in front of me. And how do I do so in a way that it becomes a connection as opposed to just like a transaction, or as opposed to just sort of a surface level conversation. So when we dive into engagement, how do you begin to distinguish sort of like what is engagement and what's not engagement?
Now, that's a good question. I think it's something that I learn as I get better at this role. But what I would determine is engagement is similar to what you said, is how are you connecting with the client or family in a way that helps them be more comfortable with what you have to ask. Right. So there are, you'll hear global questions, you'll hear, just interview assessments, a lot of questions that they have to ask, which gets to the point of what they need to know. And essentially, yes, you can check off the box and say, yes, I learned this about the family. Yes, this is safety. This is unsafe, whatever the case is. However, if we all been in normal conversations, there are ways that people shut down based on how we ask questions, and there are ways people that open up. So I like to start there with that. It's like, what is making you connect with this family that's going to make your questions that you have to ask a lot easier for both of you all. So that's how I try to start that conversation. However, there's tons of layers of engagement. Sometimes we'll talk about nonverbal communication. Sometimes we'll talk about cultural biases, where I'm sure we'll get into, but that's where I like to start. Like, how do you think you actually connected to this individual?
Right. And a lot of times too is that once you're in that engagement piece of it, you almost find that a lot of the questions that we're going to ask, they kind of take care of themselves just
Right.
because you're so into it, and the person begins to develop that trust with you, and so they start to really just open and share. And a lot of times, as we're listening, it's sort of those questions that we're going to ask, somehow it just magically starts to be checked off itself, and we're just kind of focusing on that engagement piece of it.
You're right. And I think that's what's great about simulation and being able to focus that time and attention on that piece. Because, like you said, you will then get to the answers that you eventually need to get to anyway. However, from again, things people have shared in the past, it doesn't feel like teeth pulling. It doesn't feel like this whole argument had to happen before we got there. It's just really a matter of checking in on how they're doing for their day. I remember one worker shared with me when I was doing CRA before, they walked up on them while they were working on their car. And from there, they talked about the car for like 20 minutes, just really just getting a chance to learn, like, why do you like working on cars? And some of the historical component that came from that was all part of the questions that they had to answer anyway. But again, that reflection piece was it wasn't pulling teeth. It was literally, we were talking about a car, but then I learned about his family history. I learned about his relationship with his son and so on and so forth. So those pieces I think are really important when engagement is considered of other ways to talk to and other families and the clients.
Good point, actually. I've heard that a lot of times with even other workers I talk to, which is like, yeah, you know, when I first started talking to this family, I started talking just about what I saw in their living room. Maybe they had something put up, or maybe they had, or maybe they're into sports. You know, that could be, you know, conversation sometimes. And in a way, it sort of breaks that barrier of like, oh, you know, I'm a stranger coming into your home. I think that brings on just sort of feelings already. And
Right.
so, you know, how do we sort of overcome that by, you know, at least establishing some form of connection, some form of comfort, to where, you know, it's now a human to human connection as opposed to a stranger to stranger connection.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting that you say that. Is I think while the social workers come from a good place and are trained to get responses that they need to get, I do think sometimes what I noticed in simulation is that engagement is separate from the investigation, which, you know, I think simulation can help bridge that gap in between the two of them, right? Perfect examples are when you read the case and you have or you read the allegations and you may form a bias of, you know, some domestic violence incidents or something like that. And so where now you're programmed in a way to say, oh, well, this is this sort of case, I now need to investigate this way. However, what can you still engage with? How can you take that, you know, take away that bias for at least a split second to see how you would engage with the family to get to the answers that you need to get to? So really helping them see that engagement is also investigating while not making it seem so separate. Because sometimes when you're teaching somebody who's not that familiar or knowing how to do it, they seem like they're forcing it. But when you just kind of help them engage in what their natural tendencies are, you start to see like they're able to do their job while still engaging at the same time.
Makes sense. And I think, you know, to kind of go into another part that we wanted to highlight, which was, you know, what are we evaluating, or what's being sort of, I don't want to use the word critique just because we're not necessarily giving grades for the simulation process, but it's more
Mm-hmm.
so just like, what are we paying attention to as coaches or as facilitators when we're facilitating that for workers? And I think you really brought up a good point, is that when we're looking at it and paying attention to, we're looking at how they're engaging, how are they sort of being able to combine the, like what you said, the assessment and asking questions along with engagement. And it's not two separate things. It's almost like something that's just very fluid, and it kind of goes a little bit smoothly. And I mean, there's always going to be sort of those responses or pushback a little bit from the actors, but I think it's a natural process. It's just sort of how do we maintain that composure to be able to kind of keep the flow going, as you will.
Right. So I think a good example of what you would critique is engage. Well, you know, like I said, it's not grades, but you're it's essentially assessing as engagement is, are you listening and are you providing feedback? I think is a really main topic of what we would consider, hey, this is engaging versus what is not engaging. For instance, you'll have people who ask the global questions, and some of those global questions can just be intrusive by nature. And if somebody gives a response that in a normal setting would trigger you to say, oh, well, let me follow up with that, and you don't, that's something we may want to touch into when we during our feedback process, because we want you to, and I guess speaking for myself being a facilitator, is how can you make the connections besides just talking to the person, right? Maybe their eyebrows go up, or maybe they're more closed off. There's having struggling answering a certain question. These are all things that we try to help them social workers cue on to say like, hey, there is an opportunity to see that there's something more there. And so yes, you'll probably still ask the questions, but maybe it's taking a second pause to just listen. Maybe there's a period of, let me just reflect on what you just told me, and let me see if this is something that I heard accurately. So little things like that is what we would so on say like judge versus just say, hey, just go engage. Because a lot of times like, oh, what does that mean? That can mean a lot of different things. So that's just a couple of examples of, oh, okay, I can watch out for that next time. Or I did notice that they got upset when I asked that question, that sort of thing.
opportunities to opportunity. I think, any chance like that where, family members are going to show up differently, are going to, present themselves differently and react differently. And I think there are moments of opportunities where we can sort of pay attention to what that looks like, because that could also be a cultural aspect of it as well. I think, I remember a time when I was playing an actor role, the fact that I wasn't sort of vocal or yelling or anything like that when sort of workers were asking me questions, it was more so just about how they could pay attention to even when I was looking down and seeing what that's about, or my silence sometimes can be giving off an impression of something else, a different feeling of anxiety or stress. So I think opportunities is a way to really see like what's coming up and how can I notice them for what they're experiencing and also be able to reflect on that.
Absolutely. And what brings up a good point that I think sometimes people don't realize going into these simulation situations is how many assumptions that we lead our conversations with, right? Oh, quiet means this, combative means that, and then you operate based on an assumption that you probably didn't even realize that you had. And I think that's another benefit of simulation, and what would be a critique, so to say, that we're looking for is that, did this person present anything that you believe you are going off of if from an assumption standpoint? Because there's been the times where I played a role in CRA of an African-American father that was upset that his kids were taken away from the mother, and I wasn't contacted at all. Right. And so when I presented upset and aggravated, one of the situations was, I had to get him to calm down. But at the same time, like that's an assumption of I am out of control, or I am somebody that can't be talked to, even though I'm upset. So sometimes just slowing the conversation of like, well, what do you need to calm down versus just engage and ask further questions that can still move you along in this conversation. It was an eye-opening experience for me because it was immediately like, control the situation, get them to calm down, even though we're acting. However, hey, let's just consider the reality. If your kids were taken and you didn't know, and you had to show up to an office and say, hey, where are my kids? You're probably going to be upset too. So let's just kind of take that into account and just see what other ways we can get to that final answer or next question versus what we think we need to do in our assumption. So again, just trying to provide those examples for those who may have not done simulation before, or have not just witnessed the product, so to say, witness the actual acting. Because yeah, people will come in with an assumption like, oh, I thought I was supposed to do that, and they never even think that was an issue for the last how many years they've been doing social work.
To even expand on that a little bit in terms of engagement, we can also look at sort of how it differs for each person as as a worker, engaging, because it shows up differently for each person, and a lot of times I wonder if it's sort of how different could it be for each person, and almost like what are some core things that we would consider engagement, and does it become global, or does it become more unique to each person? And one of the things I kind of thought about was words, just the word choice that we use. So when I was thinking about it, words really do matter, and sort of the words can impact the person we're saying it to. So I remember a time where someone said like, oh yeah, someone was talking to the actor, and they're saying like, yeah, this is how things are, or these are how things are supposed to be. And, of course, the actor had a reaction to that. And I think being able to almost reflect and see how important certain word choices, whether they're more sort of like, I don't know, like social work type words, or words that we can really make it more relatable to families, or try to find a way to engage families to see like how the word choices can be more in a way that's very, sort of family, I don't want to say family appropriate, but more like in connection with who they are in terms of the families. Yeah.
Yeah, like family appropriate in a way or something like that. Yeah. Because yeah, and I've experienced some of that as well, especially being on the training. And we'll, like, for a small example, we'll have CFTM examples where the term is allegation, and then we will just change the terminology to causes of concern or something along those lines, right? Where we know what we're talking about, but the point is to get the family as involved as possible. Because, like you mentioned before, social work, when presented in a lot of situations, people are either caught off guard or don't want to deal with child protective services in the first place. So their assumption of certain words can be triggering and not allow them to even engage in the process of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. So I think that's a really good point of just calling it allegations or the assault on the wife or whatever it was brought up. We can in a way soften the blow, not to diminish the point of what we're trying to make, however, to get their buy-in to say, hey, the causes of concern are this, can we get your point of view on that, versus, oh, allegations makes it seem like I'm going to go to jail for something like this, or this is not necessarily the case, and they haven't even had a chance to listen to what you're trying to say because they're caught up on or activated by the word itself.
Right. And at the end of the day, it's really being trauma informed. You know, we have to really be at that place where we're almost like taking taking that extra step to be trauma informed of realizing what the impact of what we say could be for this person. And it's not to say that like everything is going to activate something within someone. We can't really be for certain. However, you know, there are certain words and certain things that we might say that could have an impact, and we have to be almost reflective of what that could look like, you know, as we're engaging with folks.
Absolutely. And you notice what I did there? I went from trigger to activated because I'm trying to use my trauma informed lens. It's something that we learned at the academy. And to, again, I think this is a really good example of that because, yes, it may not, I may not necessarily think that that word is going to activate somebody or make them feel a certain type of way. However, that's the point of the practice, is to be trauma informed to eventually get to the solution or the strength of the family, whatever the case is. However, these little small things should be implemented into practice, and if it has not, that's the point of simulation, to have that conversation, implement it where it's where you see fit, just so you can help move people along the conversation versus getting caught up on what you'll hear is complicating factors that distract people from what essentially the point of the conversation is.
Spent a lot of good times, you know, breaking down what engagement could look like. And any other aspects you wanted to highlight in terms of just engagement, or, you know, what's, you know, maybe folks may feel like they are engaging, but then, you know, when we start to approach having the feedback with them, you know, while it may be like a form of engagement, but then there are upgrades. There are always different upgrades that can be offered for engagement. So I guess any other aspects you wanted to highlight in terms of engagement?
You know, it's something I noticed recently is pace of conversation is something that didn't stand out to me before doing this enough times, where, not to say that the person was rushing, because one thing I have noticed as well about simulation is that the intent of majority of the social workers is to do the job correctly. However, sometimes we just don't notice what we do. And then one thing I did notice was the pace of the conversation of getting through to the next question as fast as possible, having so many questions already prepared that it seemed like it rushed over some of the important aspects of the conversation that could be taken into account. And so that's something that I've helped people become aware of, because as I was playing an actor in the situation, it was realizing like in a 5-10 minute span, you might have asked like 20 questions, where maybe 10, even if you got to 10, and that's kind of part of engagement as well. Like, yeah, you'll have your questions, but where can we essentially stay on, ask feedback about, stay on just a little bit more to see where the person goes, versus just having so many questions already to go that the person is just trying to keep up. And then naturally what the feedback was, I was naturally disengaged because it felt artificial. Like we're just question after question after question. So that was an interesting conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, and we can even sort of like flip that and see, like, you know, if we were in that role where someone was just asking us a bunch of questions, like how would that feel as well? And I don't imagine it could feel very comforting or natural. It just becomes more of like, okay, I mean, I got to answer these questions back to back to back.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, you know, can it be more of a conversation? Could I could I practice more listening to where maybe I'm picking up on other things that I didn't catch on before, or maybe it gives them a chance to really process or sit with some of what's brought up. And so that way, it kind of may bring up other things, for example.
Absolutely. And even in that example, what we worked on was just applying more feedback. So when you ask the question, kind of respond to what they said just to get on the same page and then go on to the next one. It slowed the pace down, but to your point, it kind of helps with pausing and just seeing where we're at just a little bit versus just one after another after another.
So, as we're going along, you mentioned feedback. Then there could be some times where gaining that feedback or receiving that feedback can be really challenging. I mean, sometimes people will say it as, taking that constructive criticism. Sometimes it may not feel good. Sometimes it may be kind of challenging to even receive that. So, like, what are some tips or what are some ways that you could perhaps reframe being able to receive that feedback in a way that can be very productive and ways for folks to be able to use it as upgrades to their practice?
Absolutely. So I would say in general, it's not personal. It's the feedback isn't for us to feel good about telling you how to be better at your job. The feedback is just identifying ways to upgrade based on research or experiences that the actors and facilitator have. And so with that, with individuals who go into the simulation, yeah, it's definitely not personal. If you realize something that you're doing that you may have never noticed, but a room of people can, it's only because there's a different set of eyes on the situation. It's a new perspective and not somebody trying to say, hey, we're trying to call you out for being this horrible social worker, blah, blah. Like the assumptions, I would say to manage them as the best that you can. And any of the critique and responses to upgrade is not personal at all. Without getting into all the details of how facilitation and simulation and actors work, we're kind of put into these positions kind of quickly. And so it would take too much of my time to sit here and just try to judge and critique and make all these people look bad, and it would be completely opposite of what my job was for that day. And just hopefully they can learn that as they experience a simulation. Now I do understand why they can get upset, because here's somebody who has never seen me in practice before telling me that I'm not doing a good job, which I don't think is not about doing a good job. It's just where you can upgrade. But I can see how those sort of assumptions take place. And it has gotten away a lot of simulations that I've been a part of where, people will derail the entire experience just to kind of get their feelings off. They will question the entire process in general, like this is not realistic. What's the point of this? But I think they're getting in their own way, where the practice is to just upgrade and advance in a situation that you're going to experience, not to throw something at you you're never going to experience. So it's almost like checking an ego thing at the door. But I do think by just practicing that humility of, hey, these people are essentially here to make me better. They're paid to do this. I think taking that into account, you'll start to see that the feedback is more of a general perspective than just you are not doing a good job, whoever that person is. So hopefully that makes sense. But I do think it's just a matter of people will start to feel a certain way about how they're being critiqued and derail and destruct the whole entire process that has nothing to do with that.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned a great word, which is humility. I think it really sort of speaks about how do we have that humility, but also the willingness to have the openness and growth. Because, I think with something like simulation, it's, of course, yeah, they've gone through the process of going through induction. It's just a lot of information just taking in. And, I think at the point of simulation, after all that learning, it's just being able to put that skill set into place. And I think even beyond that, like, while there may be some received feedback then, I think going beyond that's for individual coaching, kind of like how we offer it. It's like, how do we again have that continuous openness to grow and continuous openness to develop, all for the impact on our families? I mean, it's
Exactly.
ultimately it's going to have a crossover to the impact on our families. And I think, the more of humility, openness, and growth can be taken in, the more it can really better have an impact for families.
Absolutely. And I think overall, the concept of simulation is exactly that. It's hopefully to impact the experience of the social worker to be a better support to the families. And if we can all just have that lens, yes, I do think you get more out of it, because at the end of the day, it's practice, right? You know, practice, you're in a situation to purposely get better. Simulation functions the same way.
So yeah, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of great points in terms of just the importance of sim, how to break down engagement, and also, you know, what it looks like to really take in sort of that feedback. I know with our time today, you know, what are some other, you know, final takeaways or last words you'd like to emphasize before we start to wrap up?
I would say for those getting ready to, whoever this is being shared with, those who've experienced simulation or will experience simulation, I would say to make it as much of your own as possible, in regards to just like, hey, this is you being able to get better at what you do already. And if you can approach it that way, I do think the experience is really life changing. It is rewarding, and more times than not, though we're talking about pretty tough topics, it could be fun to be able to say, wow, I had such an organized experience around what I could experience in the field, that there is a lot to take away from that. So just preparing people for that. I also want to address that nervousness is completely part of it. We're nervous as actors and facilitators as well. And so that is a shared experience of, hey, we're going to be nervous through this together. However, we're all trying to move in the same direction. So don't feel like you can't be nervous, or you being nervous is a issue. I'm sure when you actually go into the field for the first time, you're probably going to be nervous. So we're just trying to use that experience as best as we can to help everybody get to a better place of, like we shared throughout this entire conversation, of how can we better be a support of the families and have a better impact on them. So yeah, that's just kind of my last, 2 cents slash pep talk, in a way of saying, hey, I think it's an experience that benefits everybody. And as long as you come into that with that open mind, I think people will enjoy it more than they'll dislike it, hopefully.
Love that. I think, you know, how you frame that nervousness, like, yeah, everybody in that experience is nervous, believe it or not. You know, like you said, that the workers, the actors, facilitators, there's a bit of nervousness there. I think there's a part of being able to sort of own that nervousness, is that like, because I think as being transparent, even with families, like, people are going to be nervous just as you go out and interview families, and being able to almost be open to that. Like, hey, imagine going up to a family member, like, hey, you know what, this is my first time coming out here. I've never been in this area before. I'm kind of nervous. You know, it almost sort of shows that you're human, and it shows that you are not sort of just, again, this sort of stranger who's coming into their home, but you're actually someone who feels these normal emotions. And for them to hear that, it could bring a little sense of comfort and connection point too.
Exactly. And that can be possibly through an engagement way. I mean, not tactic like it's superficial, but it could be, as far as like, hey, I'm nervous as well. I know this isn't as comfortable as a conversation you would have with a stranger. However, I'm here to blah, 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 blah. And I take those sort of spills from people that have been through simulation, and I credit everyone that's done it, because it's been a rewarding experience as a facilitator to see like what I can then apply to my coaching practice. But one person shared with me that when they are transparent and just completely open and honest about the entire process, they said that it's very rare that you're going to get a family that's going to be combative throughout the entire process. And I believe her experience was over 12 years in social work. And so I'm not 100% sure about that, but I know that she had a lot of experience in the field. So to even hear that as somebody who's only had 2 experience in the field and being a facilitator, it's like, this stuff actually works. Transparency, engagement, connectedness, humility. You're not going to be walked all over. You're not going to have a family take advantage of you. You're trying to help them through the process as much as you're trying to get through the process. And that transparency through those different engagement tactics proved to work. So that was very helpful to hear that from that worker, because yeah, it was far and few between that she had a very combative family.
That's a good last word.
Cool.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Derrin, for joining us for this episode. For those of you who are listening, thank you so much for being great listeners, and then we'll see you next time for our next episode. Take care.
Thanks for having me, Charlie.
Of course.
All right.